I want to talk about the GOAT debate. I'm sorry, there are probably 5 million videos about it already on the internet, and this will almost certainly get lost in the ether. For the sake of transparency, I am a Federer fan, less so a Nadal fan, and less so a Djokovic fan. If you asked me who the GOAT is, I would respond with, for me, it's Roger. But I very much recognise that is an opinion. However, I've probably become more of a Federer fan retrospectively after his retirement, and after Djokovic has become the leader in most of the metrics. This is almost an inverse of the general trend. I know there are some Federer fans who considered Federer the GOAT 10 or more years ago, perhaps because of the numbers, but have still continued to consider him GOAT even after his records have been overtaken. I don't really fall into that category. There are also a lot of players who have automatically migrated from being Federer fans to acting as if they've always been Djokovic fans. There are also some Djokovic fans who now hate Federer fans, despite once being a Federer fan themselves. We'll come back to this sort of thing later. I mentioned my stance, as I said, for reasons of being transparent, but whilst I do have a bias there, I don't think that bias makes the points I'm about to discuss invalid. I think I would hold a similar view whoever I was a fan of, even if Federer or Nadal did not exist. I'd like to tackle the phrase undisputed GOAT specifically, and what this implies. Clearly, what's being suggested here is that the matter of who is the GOAT can be and should be only an objective matter, and I think this breaks down for 2 reasons. Firstly, is it really fair to say that a person can be objectively great? If there was a debate about who the greatest person in the world was, it would likely be considered a silly debate. You could argue that it's simply a matter of statistics and accolades relating to each person and those being compared to each other. Back to tennis, you could argue that because the number of slams Djokovic has is indisputably a greater number than Federer or Nadal, Djokovic is axiomatically a greater player. This implies that the greatness of a person can be simply about their measurable achievements, which feels reductive to me. If we transfer the logic of an objective GOAT to a different scenario, I think it becomes more obvious how silly it is. Let's say I want to state who the objectively greatest musical artist is. You could very easily find some metrics by which to judge this. For example, number of records sold relative to population. But almost everyone would agree that this is not treating art in the right way. The counter to this analogy would probably be to say, well, music is an art form and tennis isn't. But maybe that's the crux of the issue. I think I do view tennis as partly an art form. It's certainly a form of entertainment because people pay to watch tennis. I think that's worth reiterating. People pay to watch tennis. Therefore, how it looks has to be relevant. I know there are some people who basically clown on the idea of Federer having grace or elegance or any similar descriptive word, but it baffles me how you could view this as totally irrelevant. If tennis were played in a classified location with no audience and no cameras, and the only thing released to the public were the match results and stats, then I think we'd have no choice but to only use objective elements to form an opinion. But that isn't how it works. In other words, I don't think we can underestimate the value of a highlight reel. To be clear, my argument is not saying that Djokovic is not the GOAT. It is, of course, perfectly possible and valid for someone to find Djokovic more entertaining to watch than Federer, but that would, of course, be a subjective opinion. You could combine that opinion with the objective facts to form an overall take, but it's very clearly a blend of objective and subjective considerations, and the balance of the blend is in itself subjective. For example, if I were offered tickets to watch either Djokovic versus Sinner or Dimitrov versus Musetti, I would pick the latter. That's my personal preference. I'm not saying that therefore means Dimitrov and Musetti are overall greater players than Sinner or Djokovic, but I think it's a pretty good indication that for me, the subjective element of the GOAT debate is quite a big percentage. When this sort of argument is floated, it's common to get the rebuttal, well, in that case, why isn't Monfils the GOAT? Or, why isn't Kyrgios the GOAT, or any other player widely considered entertaining. This shows an inability among some people to understand that it doesn't have to be a binary case of only entertainment value mattering or only objective performance mattering. In fact, my response to anyone who says, well, I could just say that X player is the GOAT, is, yes, you could, and I'd have no desire to convince you otherwise. Going back to GOAT as a general term, I've already broken down my issue with the word great. And now let's look at the other issue, which is that superbly unmeasurable range of all time. Everyone who knows a bit about tennis knows just how much it has changed over the years. Racket technology has changed, courts have changed, nutritional and medical processes have advanced, the list goes on. Even if Federer and Nadal had never existed, I would still not be satisfied in calling Djokovic the objectively greatest player ever. I think one element of this conversation is people using greatest as an exact synonym for best. I want to run a couple of thought experiments on this. Firstly, let's imagine that at some point in the future there is a player who is better than Djokovic. In reality, I would argue that we wouldn't know for sure if he were or weren't better than Djokovic, but let's assume somehow we do know that. Now let's assume there are actually 10 of these players. 10 players who, if transported back to 2011 or 2015, would destroy prime Djokovic. If all 10 of these players exist on the tour simultaneously and are equally consistent, it is basically mathematically impossible that any of them would get close to 20 plus Grand Slam titles, or any similarly high records. So would we conclude from that none of them were anywhere near as good as Federer, Nadal or Djokovic? To me, this doesn't seem logical or fair. We can't accurately measure level across eras because we can't be confident that the competition, which is our only real benchmark, is a constant. It's a bit like a science experiment. You have to have an element that remains unchanged in order for any conclusion to be drawn. Secondly, I could ask, what would happen if we took prime Rod Laver and put him against the current world number 100? It is my belief that the current rank 100 would beat him, because the change and development of the sport in general has been so huge. I could therefore conclude that the rank 100 player of today is a better player than Rod Laver. In general, I could say that most players now are better than most players from, say, 50 or 60 years ago, and I feel that most people would agree with that statement. If greatest is a direct synonym of best, as mentioned earlier, that would make the current rank 100 player a greater player than Rod Laver. I don't think this adds up. My conclusion from this is that comparing across generations leads to you having weird opinions. I actually tested this idea with AI, what else am I meant to do in 2026? It was incredibly easy to get Google's AI mode to agree with me that there is no such thing as an objectively greatest player, but then virtually contradict itself by finding all of the material on the internet that calls Djokovic the GOAT. Firstly, I asked it who the greatest musician was. It told me that the most common opinion on this is the Beatles, and I asked if this was an objective fact or not. It said that, quote, true artistic greatness cannot be completely objective. I then asked it, what about sports? It acknowledged that greatness is much closer to being objective in sports than it is in music, but that, quote, a layer of subjectivity always remains. I then asked, who is the greatest male tennis player? And it replied that Novak Djokovic is statistically the greatest male player of all time. It already feels like it's contradicting itself here, having just acknowledged a level of subjectivity, but then not referenced it in the opening of its following response. In fairness, below the initial response, it described each of the big three individually. Djokovic is described as the statistical leader, Nadal is described as the king of clay, and Federer is described as the cultural icon. Obviously, the AI does not hold its own opinion, and is simply pulling from other viewpoints online, but it's interesting to see how it breaks it down. I think where the GOAT conversation gets really silly is when people start trying to compare across sports. There are a lot of equivalencies drawn between Djokovic and Messi, for example, Declaring a single football player as being objectively the greatest ever makes even less sense than it does in tennis. I could name any football player and claim that the only reason they haven't found comparable success is that they didn't have good enough teammates. In fact, the idea of comparing an individual sport to a team sport at all just seems intuitively wrong. There's one good thing about the GOAT debate though, and that's that it exists. It serves a huge role in getting people to talk about the sport, compare views, and compare statistics. Online conversations around the topic increase the presence of tennis, and because other sports are having similar debates, it almost feels like it's a requirement in order to stay relevant. I'm really interested in where the debate might go in the future. For example, the people who currently consider Djokovic the undisputed GOAT would have an interesting dilemma were a new player to come along and break the main records. What would happen if Jannik Sinner were to break Djokovic's slam total and a number of his other records? A big portion of the fan base would be torn between following their own logic and thus declaring Sinner the new GOAT, or sticking with the player they love and coming to the realisation that it's a partly subjective question. This hypothetical is tied up in a separate issue, which is the Sinner doping conversation. Many people would say Sinner could never be the GOAT because he's a doper. I would put it to them that the official bodies have concluded that the situation was not a deliberate act of doping and occurred simply because of negligence. He has not failed any other test prior to that period of time or since, as far as we currently know. Therefore, it feels like essentially all of his big achievements are still valid. The only rebuttal to that would be to say, just because he hasn't been caught again doesn't mean he isn't doing it. This is entirely true, but the issue with that logic is that it applies to all players. I could then simply decide that I thought Djokovic or Nadal were doping during all of their slam victories, and you wouldn't actually be able to win the argument against me if you were using the aforementioned logic. The reality is that this debate, which is initially framed as an argument to reach a single objective truth, is not a debate at all. It's all tied up in so much history, so much emotion, and a plethora of variants and unknowns. It's also not a debate in the same way a debate about law or politics would be. It's entirely inconsequential. Novak Djokovic does not know, and certainly would not care, that I consider Federer the greatest. Why does it matter? He has nearly 200 million in prize money alone in the bank, and he doesn't need everyone's approval. Similarly, I have no intent to convince anyone that Federer is the GOAT. He's a billionaire, he doesn't need it. I suppose that's why, whilst I think the debate in general is useful, I think a great number of fan accounts on a platform like X are bordering on parasocial and are somewhat weird. There's a subset of fans, not just of Djokovic but of Nadal and Federer too, who almost seem to act as Jehovah's Witnesses for their favourite player. They do so in a way that is condescending towards fans of rival players. There are a great many people who acknowledge that Djokovic's career is impressive, but genuinely feel that Federer is more iconic and legendary. There are also a great many people who have been Djokovic fans for a very long time, way before he was in touching distance of any records, and are perfectly nice and reasonable people. To antagonise these people seems simply unproductive. The people who I really take issue with are those who have made very recent fan accounts, clearly with the sole purpose of causing arguments. There are a conveniently high number of accounts created from about 2023 onwards, when Djokovic was starting to inch ahead in many of the records. I am suspicious that their desire to have arguments and call other people idiots is a stronger emotion than their actual love for the player they claim to be a fan of, and that seems to me to be a great shame. Some of them don't even seem to have any belief in him winning. They spend most of the match tweeting about how they think it's over for him, and then when he's won, they go on repeatedly insisting he's the undisputed GOAT. Even some long-term Djokovic fans have called them out on this, identifying them as fake fans who are just there to have an argument and have no real love for the player. I haven't really talked much about Nadal yet. Those who run the Nadal fan accounts usually make arguments about how many slams he missed. I do have some sympathy with this argument, because I don't feel inclined to look at injury struggles as a skill issue. Having also now seen the Nadal documentary, my respect for him has further increased. I've toyed quite a bit with whether or not I consider Nadal the GOAT because of this. on their own, the 14 titles at Roland Garros do feel like potentially the most impressive single achievement of all time. But in isolation, all that really does is show that he's almost certainly the best ever on a single surface. I think calling him the GOAT of clay is fair, because I struggle to think of anyone who is miles more exciting to watch on the surface than him. Clay is a bit harder to judge in this area though compared to grass. The way in which they play factor seems easier to judge on grass. I don't think it's a coincidence that Federer is most synonymous with Wimbledon of all the slams, and he's the one I consider the GOAT. Sure, he has that losing head-to-head versus Djokovic on the green, but in my head that is simply offset by the way that he dismantled the rest of the field compared to the way Djokovic did it. I do feel like head-to-heads in general are too prevalent in the general comparisons anyway. We've got to remember that these top players play the vast majority of their matches not against each other. I do feel like the way in which Federer chopped the low-ranked players on his way to the latter stages was a very good watch, and is part of what influences my opinion. Ultimately, I have no major points to make with this video. I think it's an interesting conversation. I think it's an endless conversation. We were told when Djokovic hit Slam 23 that he was now the undisputed GOAT. When he won Slam 24, we were then told that now he was the GOAT. When he won the Olympic gold, we were told, oh, now he's the GOAT. If he wins 25, we will be told, now he's the GOAT. People keep complaining about goalposts being moved. They talk about, oh, Djokovic has now beaten Federer's total match wins at Wimbledon, and now they're showing how many Navratilova has. I'd argue that even Djokovic is moving his own goalposts. He's chasing 25, despite the entirety of his fanbase telling us that women's and men's tennis cannot be compared. Margaret Court is irrelevant. He has the outright record as far as they're concerned. Ultimately, I think it's just interesting to see how this conversation progresses over multiple generations. How many people currently think that Djokovic is the GOAT? And will that number fall or increase over the coming decades? He's out with injury at the moment, but I strongly feel like Alcaraz is well on his way to becoming the GOAT, at least in my head. Because of the way I balance the subjective elements and the objective elements, I kind of have a different benchmark of number of slams that would be required for me to start considering someone the GOAT. Maybe people don't think like that. Maybe people just think, well, whoever's the best player of the last decade or two is automatically the new GOAT, and it's just iterative, and it's layers on top of layers of history. I think that's reductive, and I think it's unfair to the players that have come before. Is there a Borg without a Laver? Is there a Sampras without a Borg or a McEnroe? Is there a Federer without a Sampras? Is there an Alcaraz without a Nadal? Is there a Djokovic without a Sampras? Is there a Sinner without a Djokovic? The most important thing about tennis is that it evolves, and I do not think that if we take a holistic approach to the sport, there's really such a thing as a main character, and I think that's what the GOAT debate is attempting to identify, and I think that that is ultimately wrong.